Life Stories brings you real-life experiences and inspiring moments that shape our world. Today, we share the story of Marcus, a 7th grader who challenged his teacher's authority in the classroom. What started as a simple correction turned into a life-changing lesson on standing up for what is right, no matter the consequences. With the unwavering support of his grandfather, Marcus learns that sometimes, speaking the truth can shake even the strongest systems. Join us as we dive into this powerful story of courage, family, and the importance of truth. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow new videos of life stories. The school bell rang with its usual clatter, and the students of Westfield Middle School spilled into the hallways, chatting excitedly about the football game the night before or the food they were hoping to see on the lunch menu. The usual hum of adolescent energy filled the air, but for one student, the day was already mapped out in his mind. Marcus Johnson, unlike most of the kids in his 7th grade class, wasn't thinking about video games or the latest trends. He'd spent the weekend on his family's farm, working the land, helping his father, Terrence, with the cattle, and learning how to manage the irrigation lines that watered their crops. They had acres of land, corn, soybeans, and even a few cows. It was hard work, but it was also something Marcus had grown to love. His father had taught him not just how to work the soil but how to respect it, how to understand the weather patterns by how the wind shifted. He was proud of his family's legacy, and farming wasn't just a job for them, it was in their blood. So when Marcus sat down in Mr. Harris' science class that morning, he knew he would face something he couldn't ignore. The class was working through a unit on American agriculture, and as Mr. Harris handed out the worksheets, Marcus's eyes immediately went to the section on soil rotation. He skimmed through the paper, his brow furrowing with every word he read. It was outdated, inaccurate, and worst of all, the textbook was selling a version of farming that wasn't true. Mr. Harris, a man in his mid-40s with a tall, stocky frame, began speaking as he walked up and down the aisles. Today we'll be discussing farming techniques, he said. Most of what you need is in your textbooks. Let's go through the traditional and modern methods of farming. As he spoke, Marcus couldn't shake the frustration that bubbled up inside him. He had spent years working on his family's farm and had seen firsthand how modern farming methods, like crop rotation, were not just important but necessary. And yet, here was Mr. Harris, presenting a textbook version of farming that couldn't have been further from reality. The claim that small farms were being phased out by corporate agriculture? That wasn't true. Not for Marcus's family. Anyway, they were small, but they had learned to innovate, to use drones, GPS-guided tractors, and soil sensors to stay ahead. They were thriving, not fading away. His hand shot up before he even thought about it. Mr. Harris, Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. That's not exactly true. The teacher stopped mid-sentence and looked at him. His expression hardened. My family runs a farm, Marcus continued, sitting up straighter in his seat. We use modern techniques, and crop rotation isn't outdated. It's more important now than ever because of soil depletion. A few students turned to look at him. Some smirked, others whispered. Marcus could feel the weight of their stares, but he refused to back down. This was the truth. Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses and let out a short laugh. Marcus, I appreciate your input, but I think I'll trust the experts who wrote the textbook. Marcus's jaw tightened. But the textbook is wrong, he insisted. We use precision farming, drones, soil sensors, GPS-guided tractors. Small farms aren't just surviving, we're innovating. The classroom fell silent. Mr. Harris set down his textbook and folded his arms, his expression darkening. Marcus, this class follows the curriculum, he said coldly. If you have concerns, you can discuss them after class. But Marcus wasn't done. He clenched his jaw. So we're just supposed to copy wrong answers? He shot back. The room thickened with tension. Mr. Harris' voice dropped, sharp and cold. You're being disruptive. If you can't respect the class, you can leave. Marcus stood up without a second thought. His hands curled into fists as he grabbed his backpack. His heart was pounding in his chest. and his mind was racing. He wasn't a troublemaker. He didn't yell, didn't disrespect anyone. He just refused to sit quietly while someone taught the wrong information. That's enough. Marcus. Office. Now. Mr. Harris snapped, pointing at the door. The students in the room gasped. Marcus's feet felt heavy as he walked out of the classroom, the stares of his classmates burning into his back. His chest was tight with frustration. He had done nothing wrong. He had just told the truth. But it didn't matter. He walked down the hallway, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. Anger bubbled inside him, but it was also mixed with disbelief. How could this be happening? How could standing up for what was right get him expelled? As he reached the office, the secretary barely looked up. Mrs. Dunbar, with her sharp gaze and quick fingers on the keyboard, nodded toward a chair near the principal's office. Mr. Harris already called, she said. Take a seat. Marcus slumped into the chair, his knee bouncing nervously. He was still processing what had just happened. A few minutes later, the door creaked open, and Principal Thompson stepped out. He was a tall man with graying hair and deep lines etched into his face. Marcus, he said, his voice tired. What's going on? Marcus stood up and tried to explain, but the frustration kept rising. I corrected Mr. Harris on something in class, he said. I wasn't being disruptive. Principal Thompson rubbed his temples. Did you raise your voice? No, Marcus said, shaking his head. I just told him the textbook was wrong. The principal sighed heavily. Look, Marcus, I'm not saying you're wrong. But in a classroom setting, you have to respect the teacher's authority. Marcus clenched his jaw. Even if he's wrong? Marcus, there's a time and place for discussions like that. Principal Thompson said. Maybe you could have spoken to him after class. But Marcus wasn't about to let it go. He laughed at me. He dismissed what I said like it didn't matter. Principal Thompson sighed again. He may not have handled it well, but you can't disrupt the class. Before Marcus could respond, Mr. Harris stepped into the office. His arms were crossed, his expression tight. I see we're still debating this, he muttered. Principal Thompson looked between the two, his face weary. Mr. Harris, I'd like to find a way to resolve this without disciplinary action. But Marcus wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. He wasn't just going to sit quietly. And so, the confrontation that had started in the classroom was about to escalate. The moment Marcus stepped out of the principal's office, his heart was heavy with the weight of what had just happened. He wasn't a troublemaker. He didn't ask for any of this. But he had made the mistake of standing up for what was true, and for that, he had been punished. He walked down the hallway, his head low, the sting of being expelled for speaking the truth still fresh. When he got home, the silence in the car ride was unbearable. His mother, Tasha, didn't say a word as she drove. The disappointment in her eyes was clear. But she was trying to hold herself together. Marcus knew he had done what he thought was right. But deep down, a part of him wondered if he should have just kept quiet. But that was the thing about his family. They didn't keep quiet when something wasn't right. As they pulled into the driveway of their farmhouse, Marcus saw his father, Terence, standing outside with his arms crossed. Terence, a large man with broad shoulders and rough hands, had always been a rock for Marcus. He didn't raise his voice often. But when he did, people listened. His father's stern gaze met his as he approached. And Marcus felt the familiar sense of security that only his father could give. What happened? Terence asked, his voice steady. Tasha explained what had gone down at school, her voice tight. When she finished, Terence exhaled through his nose, his jaw clenching. They suspended him for that? He asked, the disbelief evident in his tone. Marcus stood there, watching his father's reaction. His father wasn't angry, he was something worse. He was disappointed, and that hurt more than anything. Terence's jaw tightened as he muttered, "We're punishing kids for knowing more than their teachers now?" Marcus felt a glimmer of pride in his father's support. But even then, he knew this wasn't over. His father would handle it. Of course. But Marcus had no idea what that would mean. He had never seen his father get this worked up over something like this before. Before Terence could go inside, a deep voice rumbled from the porch. "No, I will," the voice said, cutting through the air with authority. Marcus froze. His grandfather, Gregory Johnson, stepped into view, at 6'4", with a silver beard and a presence that commanded respect. Gregory was a man who didn't get involved in small matters. If he was stepping in, it was because something serious was happening. Gregory's eyes were hard as he looked at Marcus. His expression unreadable. He was a retired military veteran who had built an empire from the ground up, turning a small farm into a prosperous business. People in town respected him. Some even feared him. Not because he was violent but because he was the kind of man who never let disrespect slide. Marcus's stomach flipped. His grandfather didn't raise his voice. But when he spoke, it was always measured, calm, and, most importantly, effective. Gregory cracked his knuckles, his gaze never leaving Marcus. "They want to send my grandson home like he's some delinquent," he said. His voice a low growl. "Fine. Then tomorrow, we're sending a message." The air around Marcus seemed to hold its breath. He had never seen his grandfather this serious. This wasn't just about a suspension. This was bigger, and Marcus could feel it in his bones. The next morning, the house was buzzing. Tasha paced back and forth, phone in hand, trying to make sense of the situation. "I don't understand how this escalated," she muttered under her breath. "Why are they acting like he committed a crime?" Gregory sat at the head of the table, calm as ever, cutting into his eggs like the world wasn't about to change. Without looking up, he spoke. "Marcus, put on a clean shirt. You're coming with me." Marcus blinked. "Where?" Gregory's lips curled into a smirk as he looked up. "To school." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. His grandfather wasn't just going to make a phone call or send a letter. He was going to handle this in his own way. And Marcus had no idea what that would look like. But he did know one thing for sure. Things were about to get interesting. The rumble of the helicopter's engine shook the air as it approached. And Marcus's breath caught in his chest. This was it. His grandfather wasn't just going to make a statement, he was going to make an entrance. And everyone at Westfield Middle School would know exactly who Gregory Johnson was by the time he was done. As Marcus stood in the doorway, the scene before him felt surreal. The helicopter's blades whipped through the air, kicking up dust as it descended into the field, casting a shadow over the land his family had worked so hard to build. The noise of the helicopter was deafening, the powerful engine reverberating through his chest as he stared at the sleek black machine. He turned to look at his grandfather, Gregory Johnson, who was already moving toward the helicopter with the calm assurance of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Marcus's heart raced. He had never seen his grandfather act like this. The calm, unshakable presence that Gregory always exuded was now paired with an undeniable intensity. He wasn't just making a statement, he was about to make sure that Westfield Middle School would never forget his grandson's name. Marcus hesitated for a moment. But his grandfather's unspoken command was clear. He had no choice but to follow. The helicopter hovered in the field, the noise almost overwhelming as the blades slowed. And the dust began to settle. Gregory climbed aboard without a second thought, adjusting his cufflinks as if this were just another ordinary day. Marcus followed, his hands gripping the seat tightly as the helicopter lifted off, the world below shrinking as they rose into the sky. The school came into view as they flew over it, and Marcus felt a surge of both nervousness and pride. The spectacle wasn't just about making an entrance, it was about sending a message. And as they touched down on the school's football field, the impact was immediate. The students who had been chatting and laughing just moments ago were now frozen in place, staring at the helicopter that had just landed on their school grounds. As the helicopter's blades slowed and the dust settled, the security guards rushed toward the field. But they didn't make it far. Gregory Johnson didn't stop or slow down. He walked toward the entrance with the kind of confidence that only came from a lifetime of hard-earned respect. Principal Thompson rushed out of the school, his face flushed with frustration. He didn't need to ask who this was. He had heard the name Gregory Johnson before, everyone in town had. And no one could ignore the man's reputation. Mr. Johnson, Principal Thompson called, his voice tight. What is the meaning of this? Gregory didn't break his stride. He simply looked over his shoulder and said, "The meaning is my grandson was kicked out of this school for knowing more than the man teaching him. And that doesn't sit right with me." The principal's face reddened, his hands pressed to his hips. "Look, I understand you're upset." "Upset?" Gregory's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Son, I don't get upset, I get answers." Marcus watched in awe as his grandfather walked past Principal Thompson without a hint of hesitation. The security guards stood at attention, unsure of what to do, looking to the principal for guidance. But Principal Thompson didn't have the answer. He was thrown off by Gregory's sheer presence, unsure of how to handle the situation. "Mr. Johnson," the principal called, his voice less confident now. "You can't just walk in here unannounced." Gregory stopped just before the school doors, turned, and raised an eyebrow. "Unannounced," he echoed. "Your school had no problem throwing my grandson out without a fair discussion. So consider this my way of announcing that I'd like one." The tension in the air thickened as the entire school watched from the windows. Students were whispering, recording the scene on their phones, and some were even laughing in disbelief. Marcus felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about proving that standing up for what was right could create ripples in even the most rigid systems. Principal Thompson, clearly shaken, finally nodded. "Fine," he said. "We can talk about this." Gregory nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Good. Let's talk." The doors to the office swung open as Gregory stepped inside with Marcus by his side. Mr. Harris, the teacher who had started all of this, stood near the filing cabinet, his arms crossed, his face flushed with frustration. The tension was palpable as Gregory sat down in front of Principal Thompson's desk, his presence filling the room. "I want to hear it from him," Gregory said, nodding toward Mr. Harris. "Tell me why you kicked my grandson out of class." Mr. Harris shifted uneasily, his posture stiffening. "This isn't personal, Mr. Johnson." Marcus was disrupting the class. "I asked him to follow instructions, and he refused." Gregory's eyes narrowed. "So let me get this straight. A child corrects false information in your lesson, and instead of encouraging discussion, you punish him?" Mr. Harris hesitated. It wasn't the time or place, he muttered, clearly uncomfortable under Gregory's scrutiny. Gregory leaned forward, his voice still calm but laced with authority. "When is the time, then? Because I was under the impression that school was where kids learn." The room fell silent. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, but his words were hesitant. Regardless, Marcus's behavior was inappropriate. "Inappropriate?" Gregory chuckled softly, tapping his fingers on the desk. "I've seen inappropriate. I was in the military. What Marcus did wasn't inappropriate. What's inappropriate is punishing a child for speaking the truth." Marcus felt a rush of emotion at his grandfather's words. This wasn't just about a suspension anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it meant challenging authority. It was about teaching others that truth and knowledge mattered more than pride. As the tension in the room simmered, Gregory Johnson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. The silence that followed was thick, as though everyone in the room was waiting for something, a decision, an apology, a breakthrough. Principal Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, wiping his brow, while Mr. Harris, visibly defeated, avoided eye contact. Gregory had made his point, and now there was no going back. After what felt like an eternity, Principal Thompson finally exhaled deeply and addressed Marcus. "Marcus," he began, his voice more measured now, "I apologize for what happened. We shouldn't have rushed to judgment, and we should have handled things better." Marcus sat still, his heart still racing but the weight of frustration slowly lifting. He nodded, feeling the quiet power of the moment. His grandfather had shown him that standing up for what was right could have an impact, even if it took a little shaking up of the system to make it happen. Turning to Mr. Harris, Gregory's voice was calm but resolute. "And you, Mr. Harris, an apology is in order." With visible reluctance, Mr. Harris muttered, "I'm sorry, Marcus." Gregory gave a satisfied nod. "Good. Now, let's make sure this doesn't happen again." As they walked out of the office together, Marcus felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. He hadn't just won a battle for himself, he had learned a lesson that would stick with him forever. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant challenging the status quo, standing firm even when it felt like you were standing alone. And as they left the school, Gregory placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You did well, son. Just remember, the smartest people know exactly when to make the world listen." Marcus smiled, a sense of pride filling him. It wasn't just about the apology or the victory. It was about knowing that standing up for truth was always worth the fight. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow new videos of life stories.